For hundreds of years, people trying to protect themselves from disease carried something small and simple. A tiny bouquet of flowers. A little scented ball called a pomander. Nothing more than that. So why did one doctor decide that a 6-inch beak shaped like a bird's was the answer? The truth behind this design is stranger and more logical than most people realize. To understand the beak, we first have to clear up a major misconception. Most people picture the plague doctor standing over victims of the Black Death in the 1300s. That image is wrong. The Black Death killed roughly a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1350, and at that time, no such costume existed. The beaked mask we know today didn't appear until nearly 300 years later in the 17th century, during a series of later plague outbreaks that swept through France and Italy. This single fact surprises almost everyone who hears it. Before the beak ever existed, people already had ways of protecting themselves from what they believed caused disease. The most common method was the nosegay, a small handheld bouquet of fresh or dried flowers. People carried it close to their face, believing the pleasant scent would ward off sickness. Alongside the nosegay was the pomander, a small ball or decorated container packed with herbs, spices, and other fragrant materials. Some pomanders were as simple as an orange studded with cloves. Others were expensive, ornately carved containers that wealthy families hung in their homes or carried in their pockets. Even some physicians' canes had a hidden compartment inside the handle, built specifically to hold a pomander. These were the normal tools of the time, simple, portable, and already trusted by ordinary people. So if these small devices already existed, why did a doctor decide he needed something far more elaborate? The answer starts with one man, Charles de Lorme, physician to King Louis XIII of France. In 1619, de Lorme designed what would become the most recognizable medical costume in history. He didn't invent the idea of using scent to fight disease. He simply scaled it up and turned it into something a doctor could wear on his face for hours at a time. De Lorme built his design around a theory called miasma. At the time, nobody understood that bacteria caused disease. Physicians believed illness spread through foul-smelling air, released by rotting corpses, swamps, and decaying matter. If bad air made people sick, then the logical defense was to purify every breath before it reached the lungs. A pomander, held briefly and sniffed now and then, simply wasn't enough for someone who had to spend hours next to dying patients. This is where the beak comes in, and it solved 3 problems that ordinary pomanders and nosegays never could. The first problem was that doctors needed their hands free. Treating a plague patient meant checking their pulse, examining swollen lymph nodes, and sometimes performing procedures. A doctor holding a pomander in one hand couldn't do any of that properly. By building the fragrant herbs directly into a mask strapped to the face, de Lorme freed up both hands completely. The second problem was that protection needed to be constant, not occasional. A nosegay only helped when someone actively lifted it to their nose. The beak, by contrast, filtered every single breath automatically for as long as it was worn. 2 small holes near the nostrils allowed air in, but only after passing through the herbs packed deep inside the mask. The third reason is the most clever part of the design, and it's the detail de Lorme himself wrote about directly. He believed the length of the beak mattered. In his own words, he described the mask as having a nose half a foot long, shaped like a beak, filled with perfume, with only 2 holes near the nostrils. His reasoning was simple. The longer the air had to travel through the herbs before reaching the doctor's nose, the more completely it would be purified along the way. A short mask couldn't offer that same distance. The beak shape wasn't decoration. It was, in de Lorme's mind, functional engineering. And the beak wasn't stuffed with just any herbs. Doctors packed it with dried roses, carnations, lavender, and peppermint. Many used a compound called theriac, a centuries-old cure-all containing more than 50 different ingredients, including cinnamon, myrrh, honey, and even powdered viper flesh. Some added camphor, cloves, or a vinegar-soaked sponge instead. A few even used ambergris, a rare and expensive substance produced by sperm whales. Whatever the exact mixture, the goal was always the same: fill the air with something powerful enough to overwhelm the stench of death and, in theory, the disease itself. The full costume didn't stop at the mask. Doctors wore a long coat treated with wax, leather gloves, tall boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, covering nearly every inch of skin. Glass lenses protected the eyes from the same dangerous air the beak was meant to filter. Many carried a wooden cane as well, used to examine patients from a distance, lift clothing to check for swollen buboes, and keep frightened, desperate people from getting too close. Here's where the story takes a difficult turn. None of it actually worked, at least not for the reason anyone believed. The plague wasn't caused by bad-smelling air. It was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, spread mainly through the bite of infected fleas and in some cases through infected respiratory droplets. The herbs inside the beak did nothing to stop bacteria. The entire theory the costume was built on turned out to be completely wrong. But there's an ironic twist worth mentioning. While the herbs themselves were useless, the rest of the outfit may have offered some accidental protection. The thick, waxed leather coat created a physical barrier between the doctor and the patient. Historians now believe this layer may have reduced direct contact with fleas and contaminated fluids, even though nobody at the time understood why that mattered. The doctors weren't protected by their science. They were protected in part by pure accident. There's one more detail that often gets overlooked, and it has nothing to do with medicine at all. The mask served a social purpose too. A plague doctor wearing the beak was instantly recognizable from a distance. Everyone in town knew exactly what that shape meant. Stay away, danger is near. These doctors were often hired specifically to treat plague victims and were expected to isolate themselves from the rest of the population. Wearing the mask was, in a strange way, an act of accepting that isolation. A plain sponge or a hidden pomander could never send that same unmistakable signal. It's also worth noting that this costume wasn't used everywhere. Historical records place its use almost entirely in France and Italy during the 17th and early 18th centuries. There's no solid evidence it was ever common in German-speaking regions or anywhere else in Europe. The image that so many people associate with the entire era of plague was, in reality, a fairly narrow, localized practice. So why did plague doctors choose a beak over something normal? Because a small bouquet or a scented ball couldn't keep a doctor's hands free, couldn't offer constant protection, and couldn't give air enough distance to travel through protective herbs. At least according to the science of the time, the beak was an attempt at solving a real problem using the wrong information. It was flawed, sometimes accidentally helpful, and eventually became one of the most enduring images in medical history. What started as a desperate attempt to survive an invisible killer became, centuries later, a costume worn at carnivals and Halloween parties. The next time you see that haunting bird-like silhouette, you'll know it wasn't just for show. It was built, piece by piece, around a theory that turned out to be wrong, worn by doctors who had no way of knowing the real danger was never in the air at all.